Hey guys, we are continuing ReactJS training sessions and we are going to discuss about hooks today. In our component session, I told you most of the developer in the industries are using function component nowadays. And that time we just explore the class component for learning. I personally prefer to use functional component for our day-to-day product development. It's a dedicated video for React hooks and these hooks are used a lot in functional component. Here is the table of content for the sessions today. Basically, we will talk about the hooks introductions, why you will use hooks, a different type of hooks, most commonly used hooks. Then we'll explore the useState, useEffect, useContext. Then we'll talk a little bit about additional hooks. So what are hooks? So hooks are introduced in React 16.8 version. Hooks are completely opt-in. It means without hooks also you can write functional component. It's not mandatory, but if you are using hooks, then you will get some add-ins feature. Using hooks, you can use many class-based features in functional component without writing a class. React hooks are inbuilt functions that allow React developer to use state and lifecycle method inside the functional components, and there are many more features also. Hooks are started with use keyword or initial, like useState, useEffect, useContext. Why hooks? There are some complicated things in class components like this keyword, bind event handlers, using constructor, etc. are very time taking, very complex to maintain, difficult to minify, and very unreliable. Hence, hooks are introduced to avoid all these things in functional components. Hooks help us to reuse the stateful logic without changing the component hierarchy. So different type of hooks. So hooks can be categorized in three types based on its use. So there is no such classification in React, but based on its uses, we can categorize it. Basic hooks, these are like most commonly used hooks. Additional hooks, these are less used, but it's there to solve some specific purpose. And the custom hooks that you can create your own hook and use it. So what are basic hooks? There are more than 10 inbuilt hooks are available in React 16.8. But the basic commonly used hooks include useState, useEffect, and useContext. So we are going to explore these three hooks in our next slide. So useState. Before going to use useState, let's understand the state. So state is an object that holds some information that may change over the lifespan of the component. The useState hooks allows React developer to update, handle, and manipulate state inside functional component. So state are kind of session object, guys. And here is one example of using useState hook. So basically the useState hook you will get inside the React module, and the line number 2 that you can see, right? This is how we create a useState hook, and this useState, inside that we are passing a parameter. This is basically a default parameter, and it's define the data type based on the data we passed. Here we are passing prop.start, so basically a starting variable to our counter, and this count is the variable which represents the state, and set count is the setter method to update this state variable. And whenever we click on the button on the onClick event, we are calling this log event, and we are increasing the count value by adding 1. And in line number 10, you can see the h1 tag counter. So we are showing the current value of the state. So this is how we can use useState hook. Let's come to the VS Code to explore a little bit more about useState. So here is one example of useState hook. Here you can see we are using count state, and also one more state here, flip callers, and basically it takes a boolean value, true or false, and this set flip color is something changing the value. So if you see the program here, on the on click of the click me button, so we are logging an event, and in this log event basically we are increasing the counter by +1. There is one more button here to change the color, and when we click on this button it is toggling the flip color state by calling its setter method set flip color, and if it is true then we are showing light pink or light green. In my browser you can see the props start is coming as 5 and the current state of this count is 6 and the other state is true, right? So if I click on this you can see the value is increasing, and if you click on the button to change color, the button's color also, background color also changing. So this is how you can use state. We can also use the dependency of the state to do some other activities that we will learn in useEffect. So useEffect. Class component have lifecycle method to perform actions for different stages in the component. In functional component we can use useEffect hook to perform lifecycle events such as mounting to the DOM, re-rendering, on-mounted, etc. So here are some comparison that whatever the lifecycles method we have in class component, we can achieve that using hooks. So basically in functional component we don't have the lifecycle methods that we used to have in class component, and to do such things we have to use useEffect. In useEffect hook, if you see the first parameter is a callback functions and the second parameter is the dependencies. So now let's see the comparison here. So you see component did mount, right? It's basically called when the component is mounted. So the similar thing we can achieve by just passing a blank dependencies into the useEffect, just like start bracket and end square bracket without passing anything inside it. So in this case it will work like component did mount, and it will be called once when the component is mounting. So like that component did update in class component, it's called when the values are updated in the component. We can use useEffect for that purpose also. So if you see the first example here in the useEffect, it doesn't have any dependencies passed, right? It just we are passing a callback function. So in this case any change happen in the component, let's say any state or any values, so this useEffect will call every time. Okay, and let's say you want to call the useEffect or you want to perform something when a specific values or dependencies is changing, then we can use the useEffect like this way. So here you can see the useEffect, it's calls when the dependency change. So basically when you are passing a state value here, let's say count for our previous example, if there any count change, then only this useEffect will call. So like that there is one more lifecycle method, that is a component will unmount. So it will be called when component is unmount. The similar thing we can achieve using useEffect also. In this useEffect example you can see we are just passing a callback function. There is no dependency passed here, but here we have a additional return statement, right? So in this return statement will be called when the component will unmount it. So code returns on unmount. So this is how we can use useEffect to perform some of the lifecycle method which we used to get by default in class component. useContext. So the context API helps us to pass the state directly to any children component. The context API used to maintain the global state. By using the context API, we can avoid the prop drilling situation. Before we using context API, we just want to understand what is prop drilling. So let's understand what prop drilling is and how can we solve that using the context API. So let's say we have a few components like app, main, content and message. So without using context API, what will happen? I need some data in message component, and if you see this component hierarchy, this is all are like nested component. Like Under app we are calling man, under man we are calling content, under content we are calling message. So if you want to send some data from app component to message, we have to pass the data from the app component to man component to content component to message component as props. Then we can get the data in message component. So this situation is called prop drills, right? And we used to call this as prop drilling. So if you see, the prop drilling is a bad things. Basically, we are using component to pass the data where those component nothing to do with those data, just passing the data from one to another. Just to avoid these situations, in context API, we can directly send the data from the app component to message without disturbing or distracting its structure. So let's come to the VS Code to explore the different terminologies used for implementing useContext hook. Here is one example of prop drilling, and then we will avoid the prop drilling using useContext hook. You can see here, right? So this is my app component. I'm importing a main component here, and I'm passing a property called name. So if you go to this main component, I receive this name properties and pass that name property to content, and in this content I receive the name property, again pass that name property to message, and in this message I'm using that name properties and printing in the browser like welcome the name. So as I'm passing the name property as user.name Jack, so in browser we can see welcome Jack. Just look at the component hierarchy. So app calling man calling content, calling message. So in this man component I receive a prop name Jack. So similarly in the content component I can see the same Jack. In the message component also I receive the name Jack and I'm using it. So I need the name properties in message, but the data is traveled through the various intermediate component. This is what called the prop drilling situation. So now I will use useContext hook to avoid this prop drilling situation. In this useContext version of component structures, I am not receiving any properties called name. Simply I am calling the child component, and in the message that you can see I am using the user.name. So how this thing is possible? So let me explain. So basically to use useContext hook, first of all what you have to do, right? So you have to create a useContext object through default data. So here you can see I have a file called userContext.js, and here what exactly I am doing, right? So I have created a default username null, role also null, the user properties, and I've created a context object react.createContext, and by passing that default user object, and I exported this user context. So I paste that user context in my app component. Basically what you have to do, right? You need to provide the context to the child component by passing the actual data. So let's assume this const user is actual data, where we have two properties, name equal to Jack and our role is admin. And how can you provide the context? So the simple user context dot provider, and in the values you can pass the user object. Under this user context provider, you need to call the component. So whatever the components kept under this user context provider, they can use this context data. So now in your target component, you need to consume this context data through the useContext hook. So let me take you to my target component here. Here you can see, right, in main I am calling context I am calling message, but here I am not passing any properties. So what I have done here, right, I am using this useContext hook to fetch the user context actual data. So in this user object, basically you'll have the real data of the user context, and we can use that data in your component now. So user.name that you can see I'm using here. So let me go back to the browser and we'll see. So here you can see welcome Jack using the useContext. And if you see this component hierarchy, so my app, under this app component, I have context provider. Under this context provider, I'm using main, then content, then message. So in this message, I'm using the context data, what I got from the context provider. This is how you can use useContext, and you can avoid the prop drilling situation. There are a few more additional hooks also. So we are not going to talk details about it because these sessions will be too much lengthy. So I will be covering these hooks in our future session sometime. Just for the notes that you can get it, like the useReducer hooks is used to handling the complex state and transition in state. useCallback hooks returns a callback function that memorize and that only changes if the dependency in the dependency tree is changed. So basically this useCallback, useMemo are used to improve the performance. So this React useMemo hooks returns a memorized value, but in useCallback it memorizes the callback functions. The useRef hooks returns the mutable object whose current property is initialized to pass the argument to the initial value. There is few more hooks also. Use imperative handle, use layout effect. So we'll cover these things in our coming session. And also we can use custom hooks, but that also we are not going to cover with this session. So sometime if required, we will use that. Thank you guys. Please subscribe my YouTube channel Techie Purna and follow me on Instagram Learn Full Stack. Thank you.